Hector and his Highland Dancers. Written by Anthony Sevil and illustrated by Amy Calautti.
My name is Anthony Sevil. This is the first children's story I have written. It is called Hector and his Highland Dancers. It is illustrated by Amy Calautti and published by Little Pink Dog Books. I will now read a section of it. Hector was the most magnificent bird Mr. McFowler had ever bred. He believed he had a champion in Hector and hoped to one day win first prize at the Sydney Royal Easter Show. Mr. McFowler spent a lot of time grooming Hector, washing him in the kitchen sink and rinsing him with lemon water to brighten his feathers. Then he'd carefully wrap him up in a warm towel so he didn't get a chill, and using a hairdryer he'd blow dry him. Hector really liked that. Finally, he'd give Hector's legs and beak a good polishing with baby oil, while all the time talking to him softly to train him to be calm. Being calm was something Hector couldn't do at shows. How he hated them. He had to sit all day in a cage with people peering, poking and patting him and saying silly things such as, "Aren't you a pretty boy?" Hector would become so angry he'd ruffle up his feathers and a wicked glint would appear in his eyes. When the judge picked him up, he'd peck him on the nose. Then he'd flap his wings and create such a kerfuffle that he never ever won a prize. Mr. McFowler was always left disappointed, especially when 10-year-old Henrietta Paulette won first prize with a barb duckle, and even though its plumage wasn't as magnificent as Hector's. But he was happy for her and later admired her boldness when she reported sneaky Mick McClucken, who she'd see at the back of the show's feeding sheds with a paintbrush, touching up the faded feathers on his dark Brahma. "What are you doing with that paintbrush, Mr. McClucken?" she had loudly called out, alerting the judge's attention. Sneaky Mick McClucken's dark Brahma was immediately disqualified. Every year, the judge at the agricultural show went home with a sore nose, and Mr. McFowler went home without a prize. But he always cheered himself up by playing his favourite bagpipe music on the old record player in his shed. The chickens enjoyed the music too, and would often gather outside preening themselves while listening to the soulful sounds of Flower of Scotland and Ye Banks and Braes. Mr. McFowler bred many different types of chickens on his farm, besides his magnificent Hector. He loved his chickens, and the chickens loved Mr. McFowler. He fed them every evening with sunflower and flax seeds, but their favourite meal was the daily leftover of Mr. McFowler's breakfast of bacon, sausages and fried bread. Mr. McFowler liked to make play equipment for Hector and his chickens. He spent a lot of time in his shed tinkering with all the bits and pieces he had collected, making swings and roundabouts, high jumps and hurdles, treadmills, steeplechase courses and water slides. He showed Hector how to play the games, and then Hector taught the other chickens. They especially adored the water slide on sweltering hot days. Often, when Mr. McFowler was particularly pleased with himself, after having made a complicated piece of equipment, he'd play yet another of his favourite Scottish records and begin dancing around his shed, performing an energetic version of the Highland Fling. Hector, who always loved to hang about the shed, thought Mr. McFowler's dancing was rather odd, until one day when he found himself moving to the sound of the bagpipes, swaying from one leg to the other. "Hector!" cried Mr. McFowler when he saw what he was doing. "Let's dance together." So Hector whirled round the shed with Mr. McFowler all evening. They had such fun. That night, when Mr. McFowler put the chickens to bed, he said to Hector, "I have a plan. I want you to teach the other chickens how to dance the Highland Fling. I know you can do it. You are the smartest bird I've ever bred. And Hector, you and the chickens are going to dance at the next championship show in town." Hector wasn't quite sure about dancing the Highland Fling at a championship show, but if it meant that he didn't have to sit in a cage all day being poked and patted, then he'd be happy. When Mr. McFowler dusted off his old bagpipes, Hector knew he was serious, and he didn't want to disappoint him. It was much harder for Hector to teach the chickens to dance in unison than to play games. Dancing together required working together, and first they did not cooperate. The Silky just sat looking bewildered. The Polish Frizzle scratched and fell asleep. The long-tailed Phoenix was too interested in grooming itself. The hungry Naked Neck kept pecking at the seed feeders, and the Faverolles just wouldn't stop having dust baths. But Hector was a strict teacher, and he made the chickens obey him. When Mr. McFowler finally began to play his bagpipes, the chickens were enthralled. Their feathers fluffed, their eyes popped, and their feet twitched. They began to dance exactly how Hector had taught them. Mr. McFowler was delighted with their progress. When show day arrived, Mr. McFowler wore his best dress tartan, which he had inherited from his band leader father. But his treasured black beret had been eaten by his milking goat some time ago, so he wore his bush hat instead. Off they went to the championship show in Mr. McFowler's old ute, the chickens all clucking excitedly in the back, while Hector sat importantly in the front seat. When their turn in the show competition came, Mr. McFowler and the chickens received a lot of heckling, but it all stopped as soon as Hector and the chickens began to dance. At the end of their performance, there was a thunderous applause, and the clapping and cheering went on and on. Encore, encore, the spectators called out. So Hector and his Highland Dancers danced again. They won first prize in Best New Talent category. Mr. McFowler was so happy he almost cried. At last, Hector had won a prize at a championship show. One evening, a few days after the show, Mr. McFowler received a phone call. "What? Are you joking?" he said, not believing what he was hearing. Excitedly, he slammed the phone down and hurried to the chicken yard. "Hector, Hector, you've been invited to dance at the Sydney Royal Easter Show." Hector and his Highland Dancers gave the very doubtful audience at the Sydney Royal Easter Show a magnificent performance, their best ever. They were the stars of the show, and they won first prize again. The crowd went wild with applause, cheering and clapping and crying with emotion. Even Mr. McFowler wept into his bush hat. No one in the whole of Australia had ever seen chickens dance with such beautiful precision, style, elegance and energy. "You may not have been a champion showbird, Hector," cried Mr. McFowler, "but you and your chickens are champion dancers. I'm so proud of you." And forgetting, he bent down and patted Hector, who promptly pecked him on the nose. When the telephone rang that evening, Mr. McFowler received the best news ever. "Yes, thank you very much," he said, as he put the phone down and sank into his chair, a huge smile on his face. Then he jumped up and ran outside to the chicken yard. "Hector, Hector, you won't believe this. We've been invited to the Edinburgh Tattoo in Scotland, the famous Royal Edinburgh Tattoo." On the flight to Scotland, the chickens sat in their seats and stared out of the windows in wonder. "For your dinner tonight, would you like fish or chicken?" I mean fish or fish?" asked the embarrassed steward when he saw all the enraged chickens glowering at him. "Oh, I think we'll definitely have the fish," replied Mr. McFowler. After dinner, Hector and the chickens fell fast asleep, but Mr. McFowler was far too excited, and he stayed awake all night watching films about Scotland. "Look, there's Edinburgh," cried Mr. McFowler, peering through the window. "The city where my parents were born." When the plane landed, Mr. McFowler and the chickens were greeted by the mayor of the city and many photographers and newspaper reporters who followed them around as they all toured the city in an open-topped bus. There was such a lot of things to see and do. The next evening, they all set off to the famous Royal Edinburgh Tattoo, the great event to which only the finest precision dancers, musicians and military bands from all around the world were invited. When their turn came, Hector led the chickens into the centre of the arena, following Mr. McFowler and a band of magnificent Scottish pipers. As the skirl of the bagpipes sounded, the chickens began to dance like never before, with wings elevated, feathers flying and hopping high, perfectly poised and delicately balanced. They performed several jigs and reels before their famous and amazingly coordinated version of the Highland Fling. When they had finished, breathless and exhausted, the audience gave them a standing ovation. Mr. McFowler picked up Hector, remembering not to pat him, and they waved to the enormous crowd of cheering people. "Hector, you're a champion," said Mr. McFowler, "a real champion." That evening, the Master of Ceremonies of the Royal Edinburgh Tattoo, Miss McFeatherly, came to visit them in their hotel. "Thank you for bringing your talented Highland dancers to our city, Mr. McFowler. And may I say, you played the bagpipes beautifully." "Thank you," said Mr. McFowler, looking a bit bashful. "And here is a wee present to remember us by," said Miss McFeatherly, as she presented him with a Glengarry beret. "I do hope you like it. It was worn tonight by our leading piper. It has a feather plume on it from one of our famous Scottish chicken breeds, the Scots Stumpy." Mr. McFowler's eyes welled with tears as Miss McFeatherly removed his bush hat from his head and replaced it with the beret. "Oh, you do look handsome." Mr. McFowler blushed, and Hector and the chickens all clucked in agreement. "And you," said Miss McFeatherly, looking at Hector and the chickens, "you were all so spectacular, and everyone adored you. I've brought you a special Scottish treat to celebrate. It's called haggis." Hector and the chickens thought it tasted even better than Mr. McFowler's sausage and fried bread. But Hector has a habit of pecking people on the nose when he's patted. "Oh, I see. Well, thank you, Mr. McFowler. Thank you very much. I do quite like my nose as it is." Mr. McFowler smiled. "Yes, Miss McFeatherly, you do have a rather pretty nose." "Oh, thank you, Mr. McFowler. No one has ever said that to me before. It's McFeatherly, actually, but please call me Agnes." "Agnes, what a lovely name. And you haven't told me your name, Mr. McFowler." "Oh, it's Mervyn," spluttered Mr. McFowler, as his heart continued with its uncontrollable fluttering. "It has been absolutely wonderful meeting you, Mervyn. And do you know, I have been invited to the Sydney Royal Easter Show next year with the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. Do you think we could perhaps meet up again?" "Oh, yes, indeed, I'd like that, Agnes," said a blushing Mr. McFowler, "very much." The next afternoon, Mr. McFowler, Hector and the chickens had to catch the plane back home to Australia. Miss McFeatherly went to the airport to see them off. She wept as she hugged all the chickens, except Hector, of course. Mr. McFowler blushed a bright crimson once again when Miss McFeatherly gave him a kiss on his cheek as they went through the departure gate. "Goodbye, Mervyn. See you all next year in Sydney." From the window of the plane, Mr. McFowler looked out at the terminal building, where he felt Agnes would still be waving enthusiastically. As the plane took off and began to soar upwards into the sky of Edinburgh, he and Hector took one last look at the beautiful city. "Well, Hector, we all did it. And you were a real champion. I reckon the next Sydney Royal Easter Show will be something very special indeed." And smiling in contentment, he unwittingly reached out to give Hector a big pat.